Hello, my name is Raquel. I go by Raquel B across the internets, and welcome to another art video. In this video, I will be sharing my process of creating this watercolor painting of a peony. Let's get started. I don't always make a plan for my images, but especially when it comes in regards to my watercolor sketchbook. But I have been of late taking the time to take up the margins to do a little bit of planning, a little bit of thumbnails, a little bit of organization, and go from there. One of the reasons why I find planning to be so beneficial is so that I can make decisions not simultaneously, but in an order of operations kind of way. So I can just focus solely on a certain particular aspect of the image or painting, or what it takes to make a good image or a pleasing image. So the first thing could be subject. My first few thumbs, I was like, ooh, maybe I want to do this type of flower that's kind of tiny and small and like a bushel, and I just wasn't feeling it. So then I switched to, what about, a bigger blossom that has more folds, and I was like, okay, that's great. And then I was looking at composition. I'm like, where do I want the focal point, or how do I want these to be in frame? Do I want it to be encroached in the corner? Do I want it dead center? What have you? Turns out I wanted it to be dead center, because truly, when I am creating these thumbnails and getting through these decisions and ideas, they are maybe taking me max a minute or two to push out so that I can make the choice and I can aggregate the circumstances of each decision together in my mind. And so basically this final thumbnail is taking all the minor decisions that I made from the previous ones and kind of stacking them all together in a way that I can actually see even more clearly. Now that I have completed a more detailed thumbnail, I feel like I have more confidence to move forward with the sketch. For me and my processes, painting with watercolors, the sketch is more important than I would treat it with gouache, because watercolor is transparent, so all of your previous steps have a higher likelihood of showing through. And that's what makes watercolor a less forgiving medium, because every mark you make on the page or the paper is near permanent, hard to cover up, and will show up. So the best way to not have mistakes is to plan and be intentional with your brush strokes and your marks. And this is how you do it. I forgot to mention that while I'm sketching, all of these are made with the same pen, which is a ballpoint pen, one of the cheap ones. Like, you can get like 50 in a pack for $5. This, I think, might be a Bic Crystal, nothing expensive. The reason why I like to use ballpoint pen is because it doesn't smudge, it doesn't move, it's relatively inexpensive, and it gets the job done for me. And I also can get a variation in marks. That's why I choose to use them. I like to use blue ink because I think it's less harsh than black ink, because the black ink will show up more and is, again, less forgiving. I've yet to try a red Bic pen. I might in the future. Here I'm using the thumbnail that I previously planned in combination with this reference photo so that I can get more detail versus trying to create a flower out of my head or from imagination, which I probably could do, but there's sometimes different minor details that I just can't remember, so I'd rather use a reference. This reference does come from Unsplash, which is a royalty-free site, and I will link it below if you want to use the same image. I follow the same sketch process for every time I draw. It's all about refinement. We are working from large, broad ideas and then refining them down to the final details. For this sketch in particular, this is how I break down the image in my head. First, I draw the basic shapes. Circle for the blossom, and triangles for the leaves, and a line for the stem. These are my lightest marks, my lightest pen strokes. They are gauging the size. Next, I go for medium detail by defining the petal shapes and their orientation, the silhouettes of each leaf, of honestly each part. And this would be medium, and they're all within the container of that first big basic shape. And then finally, I refine and I do the small details, such as minor textures, and make final decisions on line and edges. And the final stage in details is where I use my darkest marks, because I have refined them and I have confidence in their placement. Now it's time for some color tests. I will admit that I did have an idea coming into this image of what I wanted the overall color scheme of it to be, but I wasn't sure. The original idea was inspired from another color test that I did from a previous painting I did before for Lantern Fruit in Gouache, and that will be linked below if you want to see that one. But in those color tests, there was this one color scheme that was a pink with a blue kind of black background background and I really enjoyed it, and I was like, that's tasty for my eyes. So I wanted to use that, but I wanted to also see maybe there was other things that I could test out. So I tested out a warm orange with a green, maybe then a more deeper red with that blue tone for the background. And then, maybe I will do some yellow with green. And then instead of making the leaves green, they're more of a blue with a darker gray. And I was like, I like this one. When I do my color tests, because I already know what my subjects are, and it's really literally just trying to figure out the color scheme and what they look like next to each other, I do the basic of shapes in a small little thumb just so I can place the colors next to each other how they would be in the painting. And then I went back to this final thumb that I had before, and I thought might as well really test it out and get in there and make it the color scheme that I was thinking of. So we have this more gray or black neutral background, near black, with a charge of blue, or kind of this gradation to blue, and then adding in the delicious kind of hot pink or cool pink. It's an overall cool color image or color scheme. I liked it, and I was like, the blue leaves they're doing it for me. And now we're finally painting. I went ahead and added water to the pan to re-wet all of the different dried up old paint swatches within my palette and mixed them together to start the underpainting. And underpainting is the first few layers of paint that you are going to be applying to your canvas. And for me, depending on the medium I am using dictates how I generate the underpainting. With watercolor, because it is transparent, I had to be more intentional and purposeful with my underpainting versus doing a full just tonal wash over the full image. With watercolor, because it is a transparent medium, I always build up from light to dark, where I start with pale washes of desaturated colors. Think of them akin to like pastels, and then also getting towards more vibrance and more saturation. Vibrant colors are darker in value. Because of the way the medium is set up, the white paper does show through, and I like the transparency of the medium. There is a difference between white from the paper versus white mixed into a wash. So if I want to get pastels or create pastels, it is a question of saturation of pigments and not adding white to when I'm color mixing. I don't use too many brushes for this painting. Right now I am using my largest round, and I eventually will switch to a flat. I use the flats to do larger areas of color and get them as flat as possible, and then I paint with the rounds, and I use a larger round and a small round. I think I used a size 8 round and size 6 round for the duration of this painting. I did clean up my palette so that I could have a more pure color and tone to my tones. If I would have left that gray mess in the palette while trying to mix up these reds, the grays would then make that red wash not as vibrant because it would have that desaturated gray color mixed in. I am now going in with a technique called wet on dry. So the paper is dry and my paintbrush is wet with water, and that is what helps me preserve my edges or draw a hard edge. And I am going to be painting in each petal individually. I do go across the page and make sure they're not next to each other, because if I paint the petal right next to the one I recently painted, it would then glom onto the wetness that was next to it. So if you give it just enough space, it'll allow for time to dry between your different petals so that it has the edges that you want, the hard edges, without them melding together. So that's why I am jumping around the page. And again, with a very desaturated, very light wash of color, starting out with a basically pink. It's a desaturated red. I do eventually decide to add a little bit of blue for tinting purposes, because I want to work a little bit of wet into wet. Oop, that was a little bit strong. You can see here me color mixing and struggling a little bit. Because the red is so strong, I lost some of that desaturation. So I added a little bit blue back in, and I want to have two sections, one for a bit of a shadow and then one for the red. And so you can see that the petal is still wet, and see how it blooms. All those areas I had painted are still wet, and that's why there's not a lot of hard edges. It has that blooming motion or action to it. So I will be switching. For this underpainting, the detail is switching between the pale kind of red and then the darker red that I'm using as a kind of foreshadowing for the shadow that is to come between all the different petals. And then because I was looking at my reference and seeing that there were some darker areas, I realized that I would need the darker color to begin with. So that's why I mixed it. Now I am moving on to making the desaturated wash of blue. Then I also added in a little bit of a blue-green shade, because these are leaves after all, and so I wanted that green tint to it. And I am making it not as desaturated, but that's because I knew that, according to my own thumbs, that the leaves were going to be a darker color. So me starting in this mid area with the color mix was totally fine. So I'm going in and I'm blocking in the shapes and overall trying to get a flat wash of color for this section of the underpainting. And I like using rounds because depending on the pressure, I can get the more tiny markings or strokes or bigger strokes depending on if I push a little harder. And I am still using the wet on dry technique, so the paper overall is dry and my paintbrush is wet, and that is how I maintain the edges. That's how I maintain where the paper is staining, because otherwise, if the paper was wet, these edges would not hold and would be blooming outward. They would not be holding their shape. Now I am color mixing to make the background. I have two types of blue in this one pan. One is a blue with a green shade to it. The other one is just a more pure blue. And I am mixing them together and then also adding in a neutral tint. And this is going to be what adds the darkness so we can get it framed out in the background. I'm using my brush to get enough color. Another thing I am taking into consideration when I am making a color swatch is the amount I will be needing for that part of the image that I am making. So for the red, I made a lot of red because I knew that was going to be the main basis. And then for this background, because it is so much area to paint, I wanted to make as much as I could. And I am going in here and using, I think this is the size 10 round, and overall getting that first wash down. It is still very light and filling out the color. And eventually I will be working wet into wet because I want to make it darker, but that is how I can get the gradient a smoother gradient is by first laying down a little bit of color, either clear water or even a desaturated wash, and then going back with another wash while the paper is still wet to meld the colors of the gradients. I am now mixing up a more saturated, darker paint with the neutral tint and the blue pigment, the purer blue pigment in that paint pan. And you can see here, because from the shine of the paper is still wet. And you can also observe and notice how there is not a lot of hard edges like we had before when we were making those individual petals, or when I was drawing the stem. You can see how they kind of bloom and spread, because with watercolor, the pigment follows where the water is. So I can place down the pigment a little bit more haphazardly and know that it won't be as stuck or as harsh of an edge as it would have been if the paper was dry. And then I am now adding in a little bit of interest, just a little bit of color to that framing to try and kind of meld that. So it's not a perfect circle. This is just an aesthetic choice. And I'm able to do that by flicking it through. And you can tell that based off of how wet the paper is changes how the paints react. So some of these different charges or textures may hold a little bit stronger with their edges because that area of the paper is a bit more damp. So while that section now dries for the background, we're going to go back to the rose, not the rose, go back to the peony, and I am mixing up more saturated color so that I can get this petal work done. And I'm going to build up the shadows. Once again, I am working wet on dry because the petals have dried out, and that's how we're going to get the hard edges. And then I will be switching between two brushes. The one brush is going to be my color loaded brush for the swatch. The other one is just going to be damp with water. That way I can blur the edges that I want to for the gradiency, for that smooth transition between shadow and dark in certain areas. So in painting in the center, I don't really need a transition between the light and dark, but in other areas I will. So here you can see I am placing down the color. Here is the switch, and now this just it's only damp with water, and it blends off that top edge, and then the edge closest to the center is now back to hard. Do it again. Place down my color. I want the hard edge to be at the base of the connecting petal, but I don't want the edge to be hard on the petal itself, so we're going to smooth it out and make it gradated. So that's what I do over and over. It's switching between the two different brushes. They don't have to be different sizes. It's just that the brush set I am using doesn't have multiple sizes, so I just choose one, and then one size for one thing and one size for the other. I'm just going to go back and forth and build up those shadows and create form. Ooh, better finish. Bear with me. I'm still trying to figure this whole capture my process while I paint. So I hope it's getting better. I think it has. So I was mixing up a more vibrant red, and I just got frustrated because it was so desaturated that I just cleared out a little bit of a spot. That's a part of color mixing for me, is that if the color isn't coming out the way I want, it's probably because it's muddled and I need to clear my palette. So I am mixing that color because we're getting to the point where I need more saturation. The image I have in my mind calls for it. And so I am going in and I'm adding over a glaze now, still working wet and dry to add more color and saturation to certain areas and parts now that I have the establishments of the shadows and the form. Doing this and doing glazes, you do have to be a little bit careful because if you overwet the paper, you are liable to create lifting or more blending and do things that you don't want to. So I'm just tickling in certain areas to add more color, as you can see. And once again, this whole time, I'm not doing a glaze overall on the whole blossom itself, but individual petals to maintain the edges that I had set forth since the beginning. And this really is dictated because the flower itself, a peony, is very like fluffy, and I want to kind of maintain my capturing of the fluffiness when I'm doing this rendering. So that's what I'm doing, going through, and I am trying to keep the vibrancy also towards the top edges of the petals instead of the bottom edges. It's kind of like now I'm painting in a little bit of the light versus what I was doing before, which was painting in the shadows. Next up is the leaves. I am mixing in a neutral tint with, I think this is a phthalo blue. Or is it Prussian? I probably should look that up. I have the paint tubes. Oh, girl, get into frame. So I am mixing up a darker leaf color because that is what I wanted for the thumb. And I also made it bluer because I want it to be more blue than green. And I am doing a, again, wet into dry technique. I can speak. This technique is called negative painting. So I am painting around the veins instead of the leaf instead of painting the veins themselves. So instead of using a line to define the veins of the leaves, I am actually using the silhouette shapes of the sections between the veins to then denote that the veins exist. I like this style of painting in veins on leaves for my watercolor paintings. I just enjoy it, so that's what I do. So, and we're going in and glazing over the color in these different sections and trying to keep the sections not right next to each other just in case that we maintain our hard edges. This is why it's necessary. The hard edge is created when the paper is dry, so the water doesn't flow away beyond where you initially place your brush. And you can skip and jump around to different areas, different sections. If something is a little bit too close and my brush is not thin or fine enough, I will eventually just move to a different section. But you can see there how as I paint this section, it all of a sudden there's veins in between them. And then having a little bit of variation in the wash where it gets a little bit darker, more saturated is always fun. So that is what I am doing. And also I am trying to respect the fact that there is shadows. One thing to understand is with watercolor, as it dries, it does dry lighter than what it would look like when it's wet. It's kind of how like if you wash your hair and it looks darker when it's wet. Same kind of principle. So after something dries, I will most likely go back and see if it was to the saturation levels that I wanted, pigment wise, not hue wise. Okay, because I use saturation in both ways. There could be saturation of the amount of paint molecules within a given water, like wash of water, or we're talking about the saturation of going from gray to color. It's a whole thing. A lot of words, a lot of techniques, technological jargon, mumble jumble, fun times. Wee wee. I try to be concise and clear, but I am verbose and c'est la vie. This is just me. And this is why my videos are so long, because they are choked with information. Just choked. Because I was the one who painted this, I know I will make another pass on these leaves again because I want to define shadows. Because right now we're at the point on these leaves where there's not really shadow going on. I am still doing texture or like the form. So I'm trying to get the veins on the leaves and that's it. So it will be easier to then add a layer of a cast shadow from the blossom after everything is done and said with the vein part or defining the veins. And we are working into the final layers of color. I am trying to review the image as a whole and look for the different levels of contrast, what areas can be pumped up in vibrancy or added darkness. Since the background has had time to dry and it is watercolor, it wasn't as dark as I would like it to be, so I am going to be adding another layer. First by pre-wetting the paper to maintain those soft edges, then adding in the darker colors, starting with a near black or sort of gray mix from my neutral tint, and then increasing the vibrancy with the blue in between the lighter sections so that we can get that kind of fun textural gradient from light gray wash to that blue insertion to the more near black areas. Going in with a little bit of gold metallic wash for the stamens at the center of the flower. I am using gouache because that area is so dark in color. That's the only way it would show up. Now I am mixing up a deeper color blue and going to work in those shadows for the leaves like I was speaking about before, working a wet into dry method so that I can maintain those edges. I'm going to put the cast shadow from the blossom onto the leaves and then also work into some of the edges, kind of outlining the shape and form with the paint. It kind of adds a nice kind of graphic quality to the overall image that I do appreciate and helps define things even more than they were. I am mixing a deeper red to add a similar outline to the petals of the flower that is on the leaves so that they kind of match and there is a consistency throughout the image. The first color mix I did was started out with a kind of deeper Payne's gray and blue mixing in with the red, but then it kind of just was too dark and the wrong hue. I'm discovering it that now as I try to test it out. It is darker, but when I lay it down onto the image, I just didn't like it. So the color mix I just came up with was just too dark and I didn't like it. So I cleared that section of the palette to mix a more saturated red, because if you remember, heavy saturation is also dark. It reads as dark in the image, but it isn't such a gray hue because I still want the flower to be vibrant. So I mix a more heavily saturated with pigments red to get the darkness that I want without changing the color vibrancy too much. As a final touch, I am going back in with the big pen I started out with just to boost the final edges even more. It adds a nice sort of graphic look to the overall image that I find complements the softness of the subject quite nicely. I am using a bit more pressure here than when I sketched because I want the dark marks. Because this pen is so fine, I don't have to worry about spread. And it's really about me finalizing certain edges. I'm not going to do the full image in completion, like every single bit is outlined, just certain points, peaks and valleys of the petals, certain edges of the different petals and areas of the flower. I'm going to add in a little bit of line just to add some interest and texture. I like it. Getting towards the end here, I do have a Redbubble store where you can find my work on a multitude of surfaces such as stickers, art prints, hell, even cell phone cases. It is linked in the description below if you would like to support an independent artist. I'm just signing the image now. Always got to do that. And my favorite part is the tape peel. Look at those crispy edges. So nice. It's so good. I don't know. I feel like it's part of the ritual for every painting that I finish that I get to do this part. Sometimes I'm like, I'm just painting so I can do a paint peel when I'm done, because this is just so satisfying. Ooh. And I am using washi tape. That's why it's patterned. They're portable. So that's why I use it. And now the up close shots. I thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. You've gotten this far. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are. Bye.